welcome to the sixth and final episode in this series on church history, the history of God's people, and I hope you find this video as interesting as previous ones, if not more so. It's an interesting period of time in which we live in the history of the church, and we're going to start with looking at the beginning of the 20th century, which was called the century of the Holy Spirit. The person and the ministry and the nature of the Holy Spirit have really become highly emphasized, perhaps more than at any other time. The century started with the Pentecostal Movement. There were three great moves of the Holy Spirit in that time, generally speaking, in that century, and they set the scene for whatever it is that God plans for the new century in which we're currently living. As we talk about the Pentecostal movement, it's important to understand that we're going to be talking about the Holy Spirit and manifestations of the Holy Spirit, but this didn't just start in 1901. There have always been manifestations of the Holy Spirit in sporadic movements right through the history of the church. So the manifestations of the Holy Spirit are not anything new. Perhaps what is new is the way in which the church has embraced them and powered on ahead right around the world. So Pentecostalism as a movement started really around about 1901, 1907. It was a subset of a bigger movement called the Holiness Movement, which flowed out of predominantly the Methodist churches prior to that. And that's an important feature of early Pentecostalism, is that one of the concerns was that we need to be holy, we need to be closer to God. So in 1901 there was a man called Charles Parham who started teaching about tongues as a sign of the presence of the Holy Spirit, and he had a Bible college in Topeka, Kansas, and it was in that place that there was first recordings or records, or we're talking about written records, not audio recordings. It was in that location that this movement of tongues began, but it didn't really go anywhere until 1906, when another holiness preacher, a African-American guy called William Seymour, he started a series of revival meetings in Los Angeles on a location called Azusa Street, which historically, in popular legend, has it that it was a horse stables. Well, perhaps it was, but it had been cleaned out for the these revival meetings, which in the end went on for a period of 3 years. And it was there that Seymour taught that there was a baptism in the Holy Spirit, and that tongues was the sign that a person had received the Holy Spirit. Initially, this baptism in the Holy Spirit was called a third grace. In the holiness movement, it was taught there were two experiences of the Holy Spirit: salvation and sanctification. In other words, the process of coming to know Jesus, and then a second experience, a second grace in which people receive the power of the Holy Spirit to be holy, to live a life in obedience to God. But now they were saying that the baptism in the Holy Spirit, this miraculous outpouring, which was indicated by the gift of tongues, that was actually a third experience, a third blessing, if you will. And so from this humble start in Los Angeles, the experiences of the Holy Spirit just spread like wildfire, not just via people like Seymour and Parham, but ordinary people who received the Holy Spirit got excited about it. They invited their friends to revival meetings. They sent out missionaries and evangelists right over the United States, North America, and right to over to the UK and different countries. And it was just like a wildfire, the way it spread so quickly. However, it wasn't without opposition, so that people who'd experienced the Holy Spirit went back to their traditional denominations, and they found themselves being shunned, even being expelled from membership of those denominations. And so that created a problem, that something that started wanting to be non-denominational found itself in a situation where they had to start their own denomination. So in 1914, the Assemblies of God was formed in the US via a meeting of Spirit-filled ministers and pastors. And so a new denomination, actually a family of denominations, was started through the Pentecostal movement. Assemblies of God has rebranded itself in Australia as Australian Christian Churches, and in Canada it goes by a different name, but still basically the same organisation with the same core beliefs, although they have evolved over time. Their emphasis was on a threefold emphasis. Firstly, on Holy Spirit, receiving the fullness of the Holy Spirit to be equipped for ministry. Secondly, on evangelism, that Jesus is real, and because we're being filled to minister in the Holy Spirit, we must go and tell other people about Jesus. And thirdly, that Jesus was coming soon. The return of Jesus was, and you often hear that from traditional Pentecostal preachers. They talk about Jesus, the soon and coming King. Huge doctrine in those early days of Pentecostalism was that Jesus was coming soon. Well, Pentecostal churches sort of remained a bit of a fringe movement in terms of the wider church and the broader Christian movement for quite some time. It sort of grew to a certain point, but it always remained on the outer edges, as it were. In the 1960s, a new movement of the Holy Spirit started within the main churches, within the established denominations. It was called the Charismatic Movement, from the Greek word for gift, which is charisma, and the emphasis was on the gifts of the Holy Spirit. This was started in around about 1960 by Pope John, I think it was, who prayed for God to send a new movement of the Holy Spirit, a new experience, a new Pentecost, I think was the phrase that he used, upon the church. And he was thinking, obviously, in those days of just the Catholic Church, and it did take off. It really got started in a big way in the Catholic Church, but Anglican churches and the Uniting Church and just about every expression of Christianity was affected by this second movement of the Holy Spirit, in which people who'd been faithful Christians for a long time suddenly found that they were able to speak in tongues. They were able to relate to the Holy Spirit in a new way, in a way that hadn't been taught in their church. And again, this caused a bit of consternation in the churches, but instead of expelling members, as they'd done so the first Pentecostal outpouring, by and large the churches absorbed this new move of the Holy Spirit, because they saw at a time in the 70s and 80s, as the influence of the church was starting to decline in Western countries, that this movement of the Holy Spirit, although it wasn't easily understood or fitted into the theology of the churches, it certainly brought a new level of vibrancy and excitement to those who'd experienced it. There were some exceptions. In Australia, for example, parts of the Anglican Church have accepted it, but by and large some key dioceses such as Sydney and Armidale, which are strongly evangelical, have rejected and remained opposed to this movement of the Holy Spirit. So the effects of this were over a long period of time, we're talking half a century, it's led to an overhaul of worship right across the church, so that the Pentecostal styles of worship have been incorporated almost universally into the church. We've moved away from the traditional pattern of 4 hymns interspersed with prayers and a sermon to a solid bunch of worship, a solid band of set of worship songs at the beginning of the service, setting the tone for the remainder of the service. And people of different churches and denominations have adopted different styles of music, but this has become right across the pattern, right across the spectrum of churches, is this Pentecostal style of worship, although most wouldn't like to, or many wouldn't like to admit that's what's happened. Nevertheless, there's been a renewal of doctrine in the established churches about the Holy Spirit. People have had to look at it and make sure that what's going on actually fits with the Bible and their understanding of God. And the effects have also gone the other way, so that the absorption of Holy Spirit and Pentecostal worship in the major established denominations also loosened up some of the classic Pentecostal churches. They had fairly strict dress codes and prohibition on alcohol and smoking, and that sort of outward behaviour that came out of the holiness movement. As the charismatic movement has spread across the denominations, then the classic Pentecostal churches have changed to loosen some of those prohibitions on outward behaviour that they had inherited from the holiness movement. An example, whereas ACC and AOG were classic Pentecostal churches, there have been a number of denominations that have been established as a result of the charismatic movement. In Australia, the most significant of those would probably be COC, Christian Outreach Centre, which rebranded a couple of years ago to INC, International Network of Churches. But it started with a very strong movement of the Holy Spirit in Queensland amongst some Methodist people there, or Uniting Church people there, and that old wineskin couldn't contain this new movement, and so they established COC as it became known. Okay, in the 1990s, early 2000s, there was a third wave of the Holy Spirit. Just as the effect of the charismatic movement was starting to wane in terms of excitement and fervour about the Holy Spirit, this third wave emerged, and again it started in North America and was associated with people like John Wimber, who founded the Vineyard movement, and his focus was on equipping everybody to do what he calls doing the stuff. In other words, he recounts how he went to a church and they went through the service, and he said at the end of it, when do we get to do the stuff? Laying on of hands and praying for healing and all that sort of thing. When do we get to do it? And one of the features of the Wimber's ministry and the Vineyard movement has been encouraging people to, as they call it, do the stuff. In the early 1990s, the Toronto Blessing emerged in Toronto in Canada, and that was centred on a church then called Toronto Airport Christian Fellowship under the ministry of John and Carol Arnott, and their emphasis was on the Father's love, but also on there were manifestations that were fairly new to the church then, things like laughter and groaning and all sorts of weird noises, and those things had always been present in every outpouring of the Holy Spirit, even back in the times of the Great Awakening in the 1700s. in the Puritan movement in North America and Wesleyan movement. Unusual expressions of the Holy Spirit, if you like, but under this third wave move, that again spread right across the world as people came to Toronto to experience this expression of the love of God and the power and ministry of the Holy Spirit. Falling over under the influence of the Holy Spirit was another new thing, if you like, a new phenomenon, although that had always been present too, right through the Pentecostal movement. People at various times fell over when they felt the weight of the Holy Spirit coming upon them, but it was repopularized, if you like, through the... So one of the discoveries of the this new wave, this third wave, was a re-emphasis of the fivefold ministry gifts described in Ephesians 4:11. So apostles and prophets and evangelists, pastors and teachers. And what these people taught was that these gifts had been lost to the church, and God was gradually restoring them into the life of the church. So the Reformation brought in the role of the pastor, and the Lutheran and Reformed churches emphasised the pastoral care of the flock through preaching and compassion, as opposed to the priestly role that had been emphasised in the Catholic Church up till that time. The evangelists, started to emerge with people like John Wesley in the 1700s, right through to the big names like Billy Graham in the 1950s, 60s and 70s and so on. And then the teachers, especially in the 1970s and following, teaching ministry, itinerant teachers started to travel all over the world, bringing various messages, people like Derek Prince and so on. And then the role of prophets. In the late 90s, the ministry of prophet was again re-emphasised, rediscovered in the church, and more latterly in the 2000s it's been the apostles once again coming to the fore. And it's as if God is raising up these fivefold ministry gifts that were lost to the church for so long, and God is reinstituting them. So this was a teaching of the third wave church. The new apostolic movement is a part of that, supporting the role of apostles and the ministry of apostles, and working out what the church is going to be like in the second half of the 21st century, as we gradually transform from the heavily institutional denominational structures that have served us, but it seems that God is moving us into a new way. It has been said that it's the apostolic movement that is really giving the Pentecostal Charismatic movement a boost in the third world. In other words, if it wasn't people proclaiming these fivefold gifts, this third wave sort of way of looking at the church, then the spectacular growth of Pentecostal churches right around the world would be just a fraction of what it is. So we live in interesting times. As they say, we're right in the middle now of this transition, this reformation of the church that seems to be happening spontaneously, organically, as the Holy Spirit takes hold of people and institutes new structures for a new millennium. And we don't know how that's going to work out, but if we're looking at history, history's the past. We've come to the end of the history of the church as we see it at this stage. I hope you've enjoyed this series of videos over the last couple of months, and I hope that you've learned something and you understand your own situation more. We're not doing this just for the fun of it, but just so that you understand that the ministry of the church has been going on for centuries, 2,000 years, and the things that we do today have been shaped by what happened in the past. And God's constantly doing new things, introducing new things, reviving and invigorating old things and making them new again. But He's constantly shaping the church and moulding it to carry out His purposes in the world in which we live, as the world changes The needs of people for the gospel has never changed. The hearts of people has never changed apart from God. And so the gospel never changes, but the church structures, the way that we do things sort of evolves over time as society changes. And that's a great thing, because it means that the gospel will continue to be preached by our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and so on until Jesus returns.